Yeah, so unfortunately the H-2A program is already so onerous, so administratively burdensome, and these new proposals that have come out from the Department of Labor and the Department of Homeland Security would add to that, adding more administrative burdens, more costs, and lots of real gotchas from the regulators that really seem to have a misunderstanding of what life is like on the farm and the relationship that our growers have with their employees. There's an assumption somehow that the employers are trying to somehow take advantage of their employees, and nothing could be further from the truth. In reality, they're dependent on those employees to be able to sustain their businesses, and so they want them to return. In fact, the H-2A program has a return rate of about 90%, with some workers coming back for 10 or 20 years. So this is a relationship that works for both the employer and the employee, but yet these new regulations have gotchas where an employer makes an honest mistake and they could be penalized or even kicked out of the program. And if they're kicked out of the program, they're no longer able to continue their business. So it's a real problem. We've submitted comments. We're also sharing those comments with congressional offices in the administration, trying to get them to pull back on some of these before they're finalized. Both of these regulations, I should also note, are hundreds of pages, and it's on top of the hundreds of pages of already existing regulations for the H-2A program. So, you can imagine a smaller employer trying to sift through all of that and figure out, what they are and are not supposed to be doing now. It's really untenable. It's just completely unreasonable. So we're really still focused on ultimately trying to get the kind of legislation through Congress like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act was, which has both H-2A reforms and a way of addressing current workforce, providing work authorization for those workers. That's really the whole big picture that we need in order to have a stable legal workforce going forward. That may not be possible in the short term, so we're also looking at smaller fixes, whether it's pulling back on some of these regulations or having some predictability and stability to the H-2A wage rate. So we're kind of having a two-pronged system here of both looking for the long-term big solution, but also looking at small micro steps that might be able to be taken in the meantime.
Historically, exports have taken about 1/3 of the U.S. crop and moved it offshore, and of course that's good for growers nationwide, and that 1/3 of the crop was worth about $1 billion a year. Unfortunately, over the last 10 years, our exports have declined to the lowest point in the last decade, and that's cost growers over $1 billion in lost sales. A big reason for that has been the 5-year loss of the India market. India was our number 2 market. It's been an important market for decades. And when the government imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on all imported goods in 2018, India retaliated against U.S. apples and imposed an additional 20% tariff, and that made our apples more expensive than our competitors. Our exports to India, which at that time they were our number 2 market, and unfortunately the tariffs caused our exports to go almost to zero. So we had been working on that for 5 years, talking with policymakers at the highest levels in the previous White House and in the current White House. We went so far as to, I personally visited with President Biden about it a year ago. We've talked with the Ambassador for Agricultural Trade and the Secretary of Agriculture and others, anybody that would listen. And so we were really happy to be able to celebrate this summer when Prime Minister Modi from India was here in the United States, and Diane and I and one of our colleagues at USApple, we were invited to the White House for the welcome ceremony for the Prime Minister, and it was just shortly after that, later that day, that the announcement was made that India was going to remove those additional 20% tariffs on U.S. apples. And so, while we were out of the market, of course, other exporters moved in to fill that vacuum. So now we got to get back into competing and making sales, and we are starting to make sales, so that's the good news. But it'll take us a while to build back to where we were before May of 2018. But at least we're back in the game, and that's important. No new trade agreements have been written in the United States for the last 10 years, and that's over 2 administrations, 2 different political parties. We think that's a mistake, but we do know that there are markets that should be natural markets for U.S. apples. Japan, Korea, Taiwan would be 3 easy examples that we should be shipping to, and we're not in very large degree. Indonesia is another one, but then we also hope that the UK, since it left the EU in the Brexit, that they will write science-based trading rules like ours in the United States, and that once again could be a significant market for USApple. So those would be the ones that we have some hope for. Our priorities for 2024 would start with the Farm Bill. That's a term that gets thrown around, and probably a lot of growers don't know what it means for them or how it might impact their business, but the Farm Bill is where Congress reauthorizes important things like crop insurance, market access program funds that are used by the Washington Apple Commission and others to promote exports, specialty crop block grant programs, and others. So that's a 5-year bill, and that's a very important thing. We'll be working on that, and Diane will continue to work on ag labor.
Yeah, and I would also note from the Apple perspective, with Senator Stabenow being the chairwoman for the Agriculture Committee from Michigan, specialty crops are her #1 priority, and so she's been a real friend to the industry throughout her tenure, and she really wants to get a farm bill done before she leaves. She's retiring at the end of this Congress, so I think that's going to help our push, both in terms of getting a farm bill done, but also of having it include our priorities. Other priorities coming up would be in the ag labor space to continue to educate members of Congress and their staff about the need to pass legislation. I can't say that we'll get legislation passed in 2024, but that's certainly our goal. And if we can't get a more comprehensive approach, like the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, then certainly looking at smaller pieces where we can do something about the adverse effect wage rate in the H-2A program, and also try to get some of these proposed regulations back to something more reasonable, and hoping to look for help from both congressional offices and perhaps some friendlier agencies at USDA and places like that to help us do that.
I would say at the top of the list of those congressional offices would be Congressman Dan Newhouse from right here in the state of Washington. He's been such a champion for ag labor and for agriculture, not just in Washington, but nationwide. And so we love working with him. We think he's been a tireless advocate for agriculture, and Washington state agriculture is lucky to have him.
Yeah, I would certainly echo that and add that also Congresswoman Schreier, also from Apple Country here, has also been very pragmatic and really a leader on these issues. And in fact, the Apple industry has been lucky, and not just Washington, but other states as well, to really have bipartisan support for things like ag labor and the Farm Bill in a time when there isn't a lot of bipartisan support for most issues.